Have you ever lost any respect for someone instantly? I always looked up to my older cousin Jake. The guy was basically Superman in my eyes. 28 years old, worked as a firefighter, did volunteer rescue diving on weekends, and gave these speeches at high schools about community service and bravery. Every family barbecue, I'd sit next to him and listen to his stories about saving people from burning buildings or pulling someone out of a frozen lake. My whole family treated him like this hero. My mom would always say stuff like, "Why can't you be more like your cousin Jake?" whenever I screwed up. Jake had this way of making everything sound so noble and important. He'd talk about how being a first responder wasn't just a job, it was a calling. How you had to be ready to risk everything for a stranger. Real inspiring stuff. When I turned 19 last summer, Jake invited me to help with this lake cleanup thing he organized. Said it would be good for me to give back to the community. We loaded up his truck with trash bags, work gloves, and even brought this little inflatable boat to get to the parts of the shoreline that were hard to reach on foot. The day was going pretty well. We'd filled like 6 bags with beer cans and old fishing line. Jake was telling me about this rescue he did where he had to rappel down a cliff to get to some stuck hikers. Made it sound like an action movie. Around noon, we stopped on this wooden dock to eat our sandwiches. That's when we heard this massive splash from maybe 50 yards out. Some guy had fallen off his boat. The boat was still running in circles because nobody was driving it anymore. The guy was thrashing around in the water, clearly panicking. He was yelling for help and going under every few seconds. I looked at Jake, expecting him to drop his sandwich and jump in. This was literally what he trained for, what he always talked about. Instead, he just kept chewing and watching like it was a TV show. "Dude, aren't you gonna help him?" I asked, already starting to pull off my shoes. Jake shrugged and took another bite. Guy's probably drunk. That's what happens when idiots take boats out without knowing how to swim. Not my problem. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The guy was maybe 10 seconds away from drowning, and Jake was sitting there complaining about it being someone else's fault. I didn't even think. I jumped in with all my clothes on. The water was freezing and murky. The guy was heavier than he looked, and he kept grabbing at me and pushing me under in his panic. Took everything I had to get him back to shore. By the time I dragged him onto the beach, he was coughing up lake water and shaking like crazy. His wife came running over from their campsite, crying and thanking me over and over. She kept saying I saved his life. The guy could barely talk but kept shaking my hand. When they looked over at Jake, still sitting dry on the dock finishing his lunch, the wife asked, "Isn't he a firefighter?" Jake just rolled his eyes and walked back toward the truck. "Come on, we got work to do," he called over to me. That moment destroyed everything I thought I knew about him. Here was this guy who had all the training, all the experience, all the equipment. He knew CPR, water rescue techniques, had pulled people out of worse situations. But when it actually mattered, when there wasn't an audience or a news crew or a ceremony afterward, he just didn't care. The drive home was silent. Jake acted like nothing happened. Even tried to tell me another one of his hero stories, but all I could think about was how he'd watched someone almost die and decided it wasn't worth getting his shirt wet. I found out later from my dad that most of Jake's rescue stories were exaggerated. The cliff rescue was actually just helping some lost hikers find the trail. The frozen lake thing was him throwing a rope to someone who had already made it to shallow water. Still real situations, but Jake had turned them into these epic tales where he was the star.